Hello. Thanks. It's very good to be here. I'm coming from not quite so far away as Portugal, but closer than Steubenville. But I just wanted us to start off by just saying thank you, not just for inviting me, but for letting me experience the beauty of this event. I've been working for the church for 20-some odd years. I do a good deal of travel. I've lived in several parts of the country, and it's just so beautiful. You are so beautiful in your fidelity to the faith, particularly to the Eucharist. And I was moved several times this morning in watching the procession with our Lord. So thank you. Thank you for your witness. What I want to share with you this afternoon is how we can come to experience the Lord and encounter Him in the poor. And I want to do that a bit through my own personal story and sharing with that, and then some challenges that exist around Catholic social teaching, but then offer you some advice, some insights into how to live it, because that's the point of it, is to live it. So I'll start just with a little bit about myself. I'm a first-generation American. My father was from the Dominican Republic. My mother from Costa Rica. They met in Michigan, obviously. And thank you for laughing, the one person back there. Thank you. And they had a little bit of a difficult marriage. Part of that was because my father, being from the Dominican, was black, and my mother was white. And so they experienced a good deal of discrimination in Michigan in the 60s. But the main thing that was sort of difficult for them in their marriage was that my mother was a very devout woman, Latina devout woman. She wore the rosary around her neck, right? She prayed constantly, pictures of Our Lady all over the place in the house, praying in tongues for a parking space. I'm not making that up, she did that a couple times. So that was my mom. On the other hand, my father was a communist atheist. Fidel Castro was his hero. He never sort of shoved his atheism in our face, but he never joined us for Mass. And he'd make comments every once in a while. So I remember, some of you may remember from the 80s, David Copperfield made the Statue of Liberty disappear and all that stuff. I remember we were watching one of his magic shows, and my dad just sort of said suddenly, he said, you know, I think some of those miracles in the Bible are just tricks like that. Just little comments like that. So anyway, the point is that growing up, I wanted to make sure that if I were going to be Christian, that I knew why. That I could give a reason for my hope, as St. Peter says. So it was that I was attracted to studying theology. And I went to undergrad and graduate school to study theology, and I was drawn all the time in my studies of theology to the intersection between faith, theology, economics, politics, culture, basically Catholic social teaching. Because to me, Catholic social teaching spoke to some of the issues that my father certainly had growing up, but it spoke to, more than anything else, how we live our faith in the world. Catholic social teaching rose up in Europe in response to the rise of socialism and tried to answer the question of how do we as Catholics live after the revolutions of philosophy, the political revolutions of Europe, and the Industrial Revolution. So that's what I was attracted to, and I studied it, and eventually I get my degrees. And then in 2008, my wife and family and I moved to Omaha, Nebraska. I didn't know anybody there, but there was a job there with the Archdiocese to help form the laity in the social teaching of the church. And I realized right away there were a few obstacles to this formation. I'm going to share some of those obstacles with you, and then I'll offer you some insights on how to address them. The first obstacle I call the ecclesial obstacle, and that was that for a very, very long time there was a lack of faithful resources. So very early on, 1931, Pope Pius XI said, he's writing to the bishops of the world, he says to the bishops, he said, it's you bishops, my brother bishops, who are responsible for finding lay leaders, whether they're employers or employees, but finding them, handpicking them, and training them in the social teaching of the church so they can reform society in the face of socialism. And then in 1961, Pope St. John the 23rd said that he said that all Catholics should be educated in Catholic social teaching. And in 1979, Pope St. John Paul II said, after calling a synod of bishops about what catechesis should look like in the post-Vatican II church, John Paul II said that every lay Catholic should be exposed to the rich tradition of the social teaching and the regular catechetical formation of the laity. Not special formation, the regular catechetical formation of the laity. And yet, so many Catholics don't know even one of the principles of the social teaching. Pope St. John Paul II was frustrated by this reality, and so in the early 90s, when he was visiting the Americas actually, he said that what we, the church, needs is we need a compendium, a summary of the church's social teaching so that the average layperson can have access to it and know how to live it and transform the world. And his dream was finally realized in 2004 and in 2005 in English with the Compendium of the Social Doctrine of the Church, which I personally think should be in every Catholic house, but it's free online at the Vatican website too. A summation of all the Church has said with regard to social teaching. But if you've ever seen it, you know it's this thick. It's not exactly the thing that Pope St. John Paul II was looking for. Thankfully, in 2016, you may have heard of the UCAT, the Youth Catechism, a shorter version of the Catechism. In 2016, the DUCAT came out, the DUCAT, which is a summary, a shorter, easier to read version of the compendium. But that was just in 2016. So the first obstacle for me in teaching the social teaching was finding faithful resources to present that teaching, because in the vacuum that was created over a number of decades, there were a lot of versions of the social teaching, some of them sadly that attempted to justify Marxist ideology, that were passed off as social teaching. The second obstacle is an obstacle of terminology. You may have noticed that I haven't used the phrase social justice yet, but that's sometimes how the teaching is referred to, the social justice teaching of the church. But if you spend any time on social media or you watch the news, and God help us when we do, the phrase social justice has a lot of meanings for a lot of different sorts of folks. And sometimes that phrase is used to justify positions that exist and diametrically opposed to the church's teaching. And so one of the truths that I want to sort of share with you is that that's a tragedy, because in point of fact, the phrase, the term social justice is ours. We invented it. It's a Catholic term. The first time it was used was in the late 1800s by an Italian priest in the north of Italy defending the rights of farmers. In 1931, it's used in an encyclical by Pope Pius XI. And the meaning of social justice actually has its roots in the theology of St. Thomas Aquinas. That's the original meaning of the phrase. Not that a lot of us would know that if we listen to the media. So when I go and I talk about the Church's social teaching, oftentimes many lay Catholics hear social justice and they run away sometimes, which is a tragedy, and in some cases I don't blame them. The third obstacle is that when laity are often exposed to the Church's social teaching, it's almost always in the context of public policy. The laity may know what the bishops say about this or that particular issue, but do they know the teaching that underlies it? In my experience, has been not very much. This has resulted in a great deal of division, so that oftentimes what happens is that Catholics question the fidelity of other Catholics based on politics instead of on what the Church teaches. And I think we can all agree that's resulted in a great deal of division. The fourth obstacle, though, is when things really start to hit the road. And this came to light to me years ago when watching an interview with Christopher Hitchens. Hitchens was a public intellectual. He was a writer and a thinker, and he was also an avowed atheist. He was one of those evangelical atheists who wasn't just content being an atheist himself, he wanted everybody else to be an atheist too. So he wrote a book a number of years ago called God is Not Great. And his premise in the book was that religion and religious thinking is at the root of a great deal of evil in the world. That was his argument. So I remember watching an interview between him and this faithful Catholic fellow, and the fellow asked Hitchens, you know, in your book you make moral arguments against religion. And so he asked, how is it possible that you can make a moral argument against religion when you don't believe in God? And Hitchens' response was, I don't need to believe in God to know that it's important for me to be kind to my neighbor. I don't need to believe in God to know that I should be civil with those around me. He said, when I get into a taxi cab in New York and I find somebody's wallet there, I would feel guilty if I didn't try to get it back to them, because that's what I would want them to do for me. I don't need to believe in God to realize the wisdom of the golden rule. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And in sitting and listening to this interview, what I realized was Hitchens is exactly right. You don't have to believe in God to realize any of those things. Now, what does that mean for Catholic social teaching? I think sometimes what happens in our church, and we do this especially with young people, is we tell them to be Catholic, to be a Christian, a mature Christian even, you have to engage in certain kinds of activities, certain charitable works. That's where you really become fully Christian, is by doing these things, whether it's volunteering at the homeless shelter, or protesting against, let's say, the death penalty, or praying outside of an abortion mill, or whatever it is. Being a Christian means doing these kinds of things. And then our young people leave our houses and they go off to college, where social animation is very much alive, and that's a good thing. And then they're at the homeless shelter, let's say, and they're ladling soup into a man's bowl, and they find out the volunteer next to them who's doing the same thing, that they're an atheist or a Buddhist or an animist. And because our young people aren't stupid, they ask themselves, hold on a second. If being a Christian means doing certain kinds of things, and these other people are doing the same things, then why am I going to Mass on Sundays? Why am I saving myself for marriage? Why am I following all the rules and regulations of this church when the church tells me that to be fully Catholic is to do these things? Catholic social teaching then, as it's lived sometimes, ends up being just a baptized humanitarianism. And I'll never forget, I was on the phone with a gentleman who's a rancher out in Nebraska who had spent a lot of money sending his daughter to a very expensive Catholic university. And she stopped going to Mass, and he asked her, why don't you go to Mass anymore? And she said, well, because serving the poor is my church now. I don't have to go to Mass. because that's what it means to me to be a Christian. I still remember the anguish in that father's voice as he was telling me that. That's the fourth obstacle. The fifth obstacle then ends up being, relatedly, if Catholics actually do know the teaching, let's say they know the principles, they know everything there is to know about what it is to live the social teaching, the question that invariably comes up every single time is, okay, that all sounds fine, Deacon Omar, if that's your real name. Again, thanks for laughing, that one person back there. This all sounds good, but how do I actually live it? I can know the teachings, but how do we live this social teaching here in America in the 21st century? How do I live the social teaching when I'm a dad who's working 2 jobs? How do I live the social teaching when I'm a mom and I'm trying to take care of the kids and get them to school and do all the various things that need to happen? I find it hard just getting to Mass on Sundays. How do we live the teaching? As a beginning to answer that question, I want to share an insight I got, not from myself, but from a famous theologian of the 20th century involved Vatican II. And what he said was this: we know as Catholics, and Dr. Bergsman did such a wonderful job explaining this, we know as Catholics that we get the truth of the faith from Scripture and tradition. Scripture and tradition, both of them. But how do we know how to live the revelation, the doctrine in the world? This theologian said, we know this by studying the lives of the saints. The lives of the saints, he said, are a source of revelation. They're not direct revelation, but they show us how to live the gospel in the world. I remember Archbishop Carlson, formerly of St. Louis, said this to some seminarians in Omaha one summer. He said, you may be the only gospel someone reads today. How do we know how to live the gospel, be the gospel? We can look to the lives of the saints. Because they certainly knew how to live the social teaching, because they're saints. So let me share with you some stories. The first of them is about Mother Teresa, and I'm so pleased to see some of her sisters here. The story was told to me by Monsignor John Essef, who is a spiritual director for Mother, and comes to Omaha, or at least used to pretty regularly. He was there in the car when this happened. The story is this: when Mother founded her sisters, she had this dream right away of having a convent of her sisters, missionaries of charity, in Rome at the Vatican. If you spend any time in Rome, and I was very blessed to study there for a period, you know there's, like any big city, there's homelessness and destitution and addictions and all sorts of things. She wanted to serve the poor there. Well, lo and behold, a convent became available. And so Mother went to the Archbishop who was in charge of those sorts of things, and he kind of tried to blow her off. Kind of said, well, you know, I don't know if I can possibly give you that. It's kind of promised to somebody else. Right? And he said, you'd have to talk to the Pope. And then Mother being Mother, she said, okay, I'll go talk to the Pope. So she calls up Pope St. John Paul II, and they set up a meeting to talk about this. But they're both being very busy people. That meeting is until 18 months later. So Mother goes back to Calcutta and serves the poor there. And she gets back to Rome, and she goes to the house of the Missionaries of Charity outside the city walls. I've been there. And she gets in the car, and it's one of her sisters, 2 of her sisters, a Monsignor, and they're driving into the city of Rome. It's quite a drive. And they can see St. Peter's Dome. They can see the great colonnade there. They can actually see the bronze doors they're supposed to go through the sea, and all of a sudden, Mother just blurts out, stop the car. And Sister stops the car, and Mother gets out, and by the side of the road there, by the wall, right, that demarcates the Vatican City, there was a man, homeless man, laid out, filthy, and completely still. And Mother walked up to him and kneeled down and sat him up and brushed the hair from his face and took his hand and caressed it and introduced herself and asked him his name and began to talk to him. Now, meanwhile, the sisters are in the car and they're looking at their watches. And they say to Mother, "Mother, we have an appointment we have to make." And Mother just turns around and says, "Go on without me." And they probably said, "Oh, dear God, no." No, I don't know, that's what they said, but maybe on the inside. On the outside, they said, what do we say to the Holy Father? And she turns right around and she goes, "Tell him I'm with Jesus. He'll understand." Now, as beautiful as that story is, I want to go just a little bit deeper. Okay? I want to go just a little bit deeper. If Mother were in the car, let's say, and they parked the car, they didn't stop, and they go to the bronze doors, and there's the Swiss guard who's going to escort them into the Belvedere to see the Pope. Right? And as they approach, Mother suddenly says, "You know what? You all go ahead without me. I have to go and be with the homeless man we passed on the way here." We might still tell the story. How lovely that Mother was thinking about this homeless man this whole time. Or alternatively, she has the meeting and she comes out and they exit the brown doors and she says, "To start our work, we're going to go care for that homeless man we passed on the way here." And we might still tell the story. We might say, how beautiful that Mother had that homeless man in her heart during the entire meeting with the Pope. But neither of those things are what happened. She yelled, "Stop the car." So I want to ask you, briefly, if you were on your way to a really important meeting, an appointment that you've been awaiting not just for months, for years, to fulfill a dream that you've had for decades, what would make you stop? What would cause you to stop? Admittedly, for myself, as I've thought and prayed about this, I'd like to think that if I saw a child in danger, I would stop. I had the experience during COVID of I was driving somewhere and I saw an elderly woman fall by the side of the road, and I stopped and I helped her, but I didn't have a pressing appointment. What would make you stop? I believe firmly that for Mother, what made her stop was the sight of her beloved. She saw the man she loved, and it just came out of her. Stop. I must be with him. That's Catholic social teaching. That's the way it's lived. You see, living the social teaching is a response to the movement of Christ in our hearts. It's not a baptized humanitarianism. It's a way of being, it's a way of living by the heart, a heart habituated to the encounter with Jesus so that we can meet him in the poor. Why the poor? Jesus tells us why in Matthew chapter 25. "Whenever you do these to the least of my brothers, you do this to me." The prepositions here are really important. He said, you do it to me. He didn't say you do it on behalf of me or for me or in my stead. He said, when you do this, you do it to me. That's what he taught. What poor? Who are the poor? There are lots of different definitions for poverty. Certainly economic poverty is the main one, but we also know, I think, about spiritual poverty. I think we're experiencing a great deal of social poverty in our society as the rates of isolation are increasing and the mental health crisis, particularly in youth, is rising. There's a lot of suffering, a lot of aloneness. There are a lot of the poor around us. So who are the poor? The poor are those whom Christ points out to us in the moment. those he places before us. St. Augustine sort of talked about this many, many years ago. He places them before us so that we can encounter him in them. And this is a beautiful sort of tripartite mystery here. When we encounter the poor, he tells us we encounter him. And when we do so, we're doing so as him, as Christ. And what's more, he gives us the power to serve them, and to serve them well as he would. How do we do this? What Mother Teresa and so many saints understood was the key to seeing and being with and serving the poor is the Eucharist. The Eucharist transforms us and conditions our hearts so that we can receive the poor as Jesus. Anyone can serve the poor. Anyone. Christopher Hitchens was right in that. What the Christian does is the Christian serves the poor as Jesus, to encounter him there. And this is possible because of love, because of the earth-shattering, life-transforming love that he demonstrated to us on the cross, and that lives on in substantial reality in the Eucharist. I'm sure many of you have heard the story of Mother Teresa when she was in Calcutta, and the sisters were concerned that they weren't able to have enough time in the day to serve those they were serving properly. And so what did Mother do? She added another holy hour. She added a holy hour to the day because she understood that only in the Eucharist can they learn how to love the poor properly. She said, quote, "We love the poor with a deeper and greater faith because of the Eucharist." Or I could mention servant of God Dorothy Day, the founder of the Catholic worker movement here in the United States. A Benedictine oblate, a woman who prayed the rosary every day, prayed the Liturgy of the Hours, went on retreats regularly. Sometime in the late 60s, at one of the Catholic worker farms where everybody was allowed to come live and live in communion and they prayed together, there were a couple of young men who were complaining that they were celebrating Mass in the morning and wasting time when they could be out working with and for the poor. And Dorothy Day took them aside and she says, "You don't understand. The Mass is the work. There is no work without the Mass, without the Eucharist. Because without it, then it's just baptized humanitarianism." What does the Eucharist do for us on a practical level? These are all beautiful stories, but what does it do for us on a practical level? Exactly how does it transform us? And what can we do? Because the Church's social teaching is about actually living this out. What we can do, I think, and I would argue, is we can become more sensitive to our hearts that are habituated to Christ's love. And what does that look like? I'm going to tell you a story that makes me look like an idiot, but people like the story, and so I'm going to share it. Many years ago, after we moved to Omaha, my wife and I were renting a place, and I worked for the church, so it took us a while to scrape together enough money to buy a house. A very old house with a lot of problems, but it was our house. And we spent a lot of money on the house. And the fanciest thing about this house was not inside the house, but outside. It had an in-ground sprinkler system. I've never dealt with one in my whole life. And in that part of the country, I'm not sure if you do the same here, but it gets so cold in the winter time that you have to blow the system out because if you don't, then the water could freeze and break the pipes, and then you got a problem. But I had spent so much money on this house, I said, I am not spending another dime on this house. And so I just didn't use it for the last couple months of the season, hoping it would evaporate and let it go. And by the way, it was fine the next year. It's not where the story is going. But now it's springtime, and I come home from work. I have a detached garage, and it's about 40 feet between the back of my garage door and the back of my house. And I look down, and I see the grass is starting to green a little bit, and so I have this just simple thought. I should probably turn on the sprinkler system. And immediately, anxiety starts to well up in my heart, and my imagination takes off. And I say, what if I wake up 3 days from now, and there's a small lake in my backyard because the sprinkler system is broken, and all that water is seeping out, and now it's a lake. So I tamp down my anxiety, and I say, it's okay, Omar, you just pay somebody to come fix it. But now I'm thinking, oh great, now I gotta pay somebody to come in and fix this, and I gotta pay the water bill on all this water going out. So my anxiety goes up again. And then I tamp it back down, and I say, it's okay, Omar, you don't have to pay somebody, you can do it yourself. But now anxiety's back up the roof. Well, now I gotta waste time doing this and digging out. I'm losing 2 or 3 weekends when I could be doing other work, making money for the family, and opportunity lost is all that stuff, right? Anxiety's way up again. And I tamp it back down, and I say, it's okay, Omar. You don't have to fix it at all. Just turn off the sprinkler system and water your lawn like you've always watered your lawn. Get the hose out, you have the thing that goes back and forth, right? It'll be fine. And then I think to myself, yeah, but if I do that, everyone in the neighborhood will know I'm an idiot. I'm either too stupid to learn how to use the system, or I've already broken it. Now, by this point, all this in 40 feet between the back of my garage and the back of my house, I'm at the back door of my house, and I'm red hot with anger and embarrassment and anxiety. Now, the old me would have gone into the house, and I would have thrown my briefcase down, probably would have yelled at some kid, kicked some Lego out of my way. But because I was already in diaconate formation, I had made a commitment to do a holy hour every week and to specifically pay attention to precisely what the Lord is saying to me in my heart. And for the first time in my life, I stopped. And I asked myself, what is going on, Omar? It's a sprinkler system. Why are you so angry? So I retraced my steps, my thought patterns. I had this thought and anxiety, and then this thought and anxiety, and this thought and anxiety. And then I got to that thought, everybody will know you're stupid. And there it was. There was this deep pain. That's what got me so angry. And then I said, I think even I said this out loud as I'm outside my back door. I said, there it is. I have something to take to Jesus now. I have something to bring to him in adoration. I have something to pray to him specifically, to ask him specifically that I would care more about what he thinks of me, about the truth of his love for me, than about what other people think about me. But I was able to do that only because I had grown in the habit of paying attention to this, to the heart. In spirituality, we talk about the affective movements of the heart. And St. Ignatius of Loyola talks about this as well in the spiritual exercises. When you're paying attention to consolation and desolation and discernment of spirits, right, what are you paying attention to? You're paying attention to the affective movements of the heart. He says, be aware. Be aware. Understand, says St. Ignatius, and then act. Yeah, I was able to do that only because of the sensitivity that I had grown in relationship with and an encounter with the Eucharist. The Eucharist had transformed me to be more attentive to that ping in the heart. And so when the poor then present themselves before me, or when Christ places them before me, that heart responds. And I can grow in the habit of responding positively to the impetus of Jesus, to his call. Let me share with you then another story about another saint. And then I'll draw this back in to how we can bring this forward out into our lives. The saint's name is Saint Germaine, Cousine de Pibrac. She was born in 1579. And she was born with a withered right hand. She was disabled. And what's more, she developed lymphadenitis. Her lymph nodes weren't working properly, and she had very unsightly bumps and tumors that would grow on her back and on her neck, and they would be discolored and turn purple and black. And because of these disabilities, these deformities, her stepmother and her father treated her horribly. During the summer months, they had her sleep out in the barn. In the winter months, she would sleep under the stairs on straw. She was not allowed to eat at the table with the other children. Any food she got was given after everybody else had finished eating. If she was ever naughty or done something wrong, she would be beaten by her stepmother. And what's more is they sent her out to be the shepherdess for the family. We tend to romanticize shepherds, especially around Christmas time. We imagine them, these rosy-cheeked individuals with lutes and things. Right? But in reality, shepherds in the ancient world were scum of the earth. The shepherds are the ones you want away from the rest of the villagers. Being a shepherd is dangerous work around smelly animals away from the protection of the village. So they sent this girl off to be out in the fields by herself with the sheep. But it was in the fields that she encountered her God. It was in the fields that she learned how to pray the rosary. It was in the fields that at night, when she would look up to see the stars, she saw the eyes of God smiling down upon her. And when she saw the wind going over the grass, she saw the movement of the Holy Spirit. Now, on one winter's day in 1601, it was January of 1601. It was snow all over the place. She lived and grew up in southern France in the foothills of the Pyrenees. It's a mountainous region. And the neighbors heard a big ruckus. Now, by this point, the neighbors who had come to know Germaine, who was in her early 20s at this point, began to realize this was a holy woman, but the stepmother hadn't. And they heard Germaine running from the house out into the cold snow, and the mother was swinging a stick and calling her thief, accusing her of stealing bread from the family's table. And indeed, Germaine had an apron and had wrapped up something. She was hiding something in there. The neighbors, who had grown very annoyed with the stepmother and her treatment of Germaine, were about to step in when the stepmother grabbed the apron and ripped it. But instead of bread falling out, summer flowers came tumbling out of her apron and fell upon the snow. And in that moment, the stepmother and her father, and indeed the whole village, realized just how much Jesus loved this little girl. They repented, and they said, "Please, Germaine, take our bed." And she said, "No, I prefer to stay small under the stairs where I met my Jesus." Now, as amazing as that story is so far, what has always blown me away about Saint Germaine cuisine of Pibrac, France, is that whenever she was shown any kindness, whenever anybody took pity on her and gave her some money or a piece of bread, the first thing she would do was to try to find someone else who was in greater need than her to give it to them. Why? She said it was because then, in that way, I can encounter my Lord once more. Because that's what he said. You do this to me. And this was possible for Germaine because of her relationship with the Eucharist. And in fact, this little part of the story is in the Eucharistic display in that long hall. You see, every day, Germaine would be in the fields and the church bell would ring in time for Mass. And so she would take her shepherd's crook and she would stick it in the ground and she would instruct her sheep, right, to stay there and tell her guardian angel to protect them. She never lost a sheep, by the way. And she would run down the hill, and there was a little stream that separated the fields from the church, and she'd skip over the stream and go to Mass every single day. But one day in the spring, the snows were melting in the mountains, there was a great downpour, and that little stream turned into a big river. And it was pouring rain. And the women in the church at Mass said, well, I guess we're not going to see Germaine today. But then there she was. She showed up. And after Mass, one of the women who had shown up late, she said, I saw the whole thing. Germaine was coming down the hill, and as she approached the river, it got smaller and smaller and smaller and turned back into a little creek. And she skipped over it, and she went back, and then went right back to being a river. So God parted the waters for his little Germaine. Germaine could see the poor, could love even her parents who had abused her because of her relationship with the Eucharist, because of what Christ compelled her to do. I laughed to myself when I saw this in your programs. And the advertisement for Catholic Charities, it says this right here, the love of Christ impels us. It's one of my favorite verses in all of sacred scripture, 2 Corinthians 5:14. The love of Christ compels us. It's actually the title of my book, The Urging of Christ's Love. Right? It's Christ who does this. That's authentic social teaching. But in the verse right before that, in verse 13, this is what St. Paul writes. He says, for if we are out of our minds, it's for God. If we are out of our minds, it's for God. Humanitarianism, and there's nothing wrong with it, but it's safe. It's rational. Living the social teaching, living the Christian life is a kind of holy madness. Some of you are familiar with that beautiful prayer of St. Ignatius, the Anima Christi, soul of Christ, sanctify me. Body of Christ, save me. Blood of Christ, inebriate me. Inebriate me. What an odd thing to pray for. It's a holy madness. And so I end then just with an invitation to spend time with the Eucharist is to condition and habituate your heart to encounter the poor wherever Christ places them for you to encounter. And if we take that time and we allow ourselves to be inebriated by the sacred species, we can do what Pope Pius XI asked, which is transform the world. God bless you, and thank you for being here.